September 15th, 1973, Monument Valley. Charles Bronson stumbled onto Frank McCarthy's set at 5:47 a.m., reeking of bourbon and barely able to stand. Steve McQueen took one look at him and said 5 words that cut through the desert air like a blade. Some cowboys shouldn't ride anymore. The 40-person crew went dead silent. Bronson's hand moved toward his hip, old Western habit. McQueen didn't flinch. What happened next would end one man's career and save another's life, because neither actor knew that 15 years earlier, on a blood-soaked set in Durango, they'd both been marked for death. The killer had waited patiently, planned perfectly, and now, with cameras rolling and the whole world watching, he was finally ready to collect. The morning Charles Bronson showed up drunk. The morning Steve McQueen's cold reply saved them both. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Bulldog McCarthy felt the familiar burn of acid crawling up his throat as he watched 30 years of Hollywood stunts flash before his eyes, most of them his own, back when directors still trusted him behind the wheel instead of just behind the camera. The silence stretched like a taut wire between the two men. Bronson swayed slightly, his weathered face carved into something between a sneer and a grimace. McQueen stood statue still, those ice-blue eyes never wavering. Frank had seen that look before, the same cold calculation McQueen wore when he'd thread a motorcycle through traffic at 90 miles per hour in Bullet. "Charlie." Frank's voice cut through the tension, rough as sandpaper. He stepped between them, his boots crunching on the red dirt. "Let's get some coffee in you." Bronson's bloodshot eyes found Frank's face, and for a moment something flickered there. Recognition, maybe even shame. "I'm fine, Bulldog. Just need to get my head straight." "Your head's been crooked since Durango," McQueen said quietly, but his words carried across the set like a gunshot. Frank felt his blood turn to ice water. Nobody talked about Durango, not anymore. Not after the lawyers and the studio fixers had buried that whole mess 6 feet under with enough concrete to build a highway. The crew began to shuffle nervously. Grips adjusted equipment that didn't need adjusting. The script supervisor suddenly found her pages fascinating. Even the catering truck seemed to rumble a little quieter, as if the whole desert was holding its breath. Frank had been directing for exactly 14 days. His first major picture after 3 decades of coordinating other men's visions, other men's glory shots. Dawn's Last Light was supposed to be his redemption story, the Western that would prove Frank McCarthy could helm a picture instead of just risking his neck for one. The studio had given him Charles Bronson and Steve McQueen, 2 box office giants with egos to match, and told him to make magic happen in Monument Valley. What they hadn't told him was that both men were walking powder kegs, and that putting them together would be like striking a match in a dynamite factory. 15 years, Charlie," McQueen continued, his voice carrying that trademark coolness that made millions of women swoon and just as many men want to punch him. 15 years, and you still can't handle what happened to Elena Vasquez." Bronson's hand dropped away from his hip, but his whole body went rigid. "Don't you say her name. Don't you ever—" "Gentlemen." Frank's voice cracked like a whip. "We've got $60,000 worth of equipment here and a crew that's been working since midnight to get this sunrise shot. Whatever ghosts you're carrying, they can wait until wrap." But Frank knew they couldn't wait. He could see it in the way Bronson's hands shook, and it wasn't just the bourbon. He could see it in the way McQueen's jaw tightened, like he was chewing on words that might draw blood if he spat them out. Elena Vasquez. Christ, Frank hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in a decade. The beautiful Mexican actress who was supposed to be the next big thing, who ended up buried in a closed casket funeral after what the papers called a tragic stunt accident during the filming of Blood and Sand. Frank remembered the screaming, the twisted metal, the way the studio bosses showed up faster than the ambulances, their briefcases full of hush money and non-disclosure agreements. He also remembered the look in Charles Bronson's eyes that day, the same haunted expression Charlie wore right now, magnified by whiskey and 15 years of guilt. "Places, everyone?" Frank called out, forcing authority into his voice he didn't feel. "We've got golden hour light for exactly 37 minutes. Charlie, you're riding Thunder. He's the Black Stallion. Steve, you take Midnight. The scene is simple. You ride toward each other, stop 10 feet apart, exchange the dialogue from scene 47, then ride off in opposite directions. Just like old times," McQueen said, and Frank caught the edge in his voice. As the crew scrambled to their positions, Frank pulled out his father's pocket watch, the one thing he'd kept from his life before Hollywood. 6:03 a.m. The sun was painting the monument rocks in shades of gold and crimson, the kind of natural lighting that made directors weep with joy. But Frank felt only dread settling in his stomach like a cold stone. Because as he watched Bronson struggle to mount his horse and McQueen check his rifle with military precision, Frank realized something that made his blood run cold. Someone had specifically requested these two actors for this particular scene. Someone who knew about Durango. Someone who remembered Elena Vasquez. Someone who wanted Charles Bronson and Steve McQueen in the same place at the same time, with cameras rolling and the whole world watching. Frank looked around at his crew, studying faces he thought he knew, wondering which one had been waiting 15 years for this moment. Thunder and Midnight pawed the ground restlessly, as if they could sense what their riders couldn't yet see, that this wasn't just another scene. It was an execution. The pocket watch clicked shut in Frank's palm with the finality of a coffin lid, 6:03 and counting down. He'd learned to measure his life in minutes and seconds, the precise timing of a motorcycle jump, the exact moment when a squib would detonate against an actor's chest, the narrow window between a perfect stunt and a man's death. Frank studied his crew with new eyes, cataloging faces like a detective at a crime scene. There was Miguel Santos, his first assistant director, a thin man with nervous hands who'd worked on 3 of Frank's pictures. Rita Coleman, script supervisor, 28 years in the business and sharp as a razor. Behind the main camera stood Tommy Chen, director of photography, whose steady hands had captured some of the most beautiful shots Frank had ever seen. Any one of them could have orchestrated this moment. Any one of them could have whispered the right words to the right studio executive, suggested that Charles Bronson and Steve McQueen would be perfect for this particular dawn scene. But why? What was worth waiting 15 years to accomplish? Frank's mind drifted back to Durango, to that sweltering morning when everything changed. He'd been coordinating stunts for Blood and Sand, a forgettable western that should have launched Elena Vasquez to stardom. Instead, it became her grave marker. The crash had been horrific, a simple car chase gone wrong when the brakes failed on Elena's vehicle. She'd careened off a canyon road at 60 miles per hour while Bronson and McQueen watched helplessly from their horses 50 yards away. The official report blamed mechanical failure, but Frank remembered things the report didn't mention, like how Elena had been asking questions about the production, about money being moved around in ways that didn't make sense, like how she'd been scheduled for a different scene that morning until someone changed the call sheet at the last minute. Like how Charles Bronson had been drinking heavily even then, drowning something that looked an awful lot like guilt. "Frank." The voice belonged to Rita Coleman, who'd appeared at his elbow like smoke. "The light's burning. We need to roll in the next 90 seconds if we want to catch it." Frank nodded, then studied Rita's face more carefully. She'd been Elena's friend, he remembered now. They'd shared a trailer, laughed together between takes. Rita had been the one to identify the body when Elena's face was too damaged for anyone else to look. "Rita," Frank said carefully, "remind me who suggested this particular scene setup. Was it the studio or—" "Cameras rolling!" Tommy Chen called out, and the moment was lost. Frank watched through the viewfinder as Charles Bronson managed to mount Thunder with the desperate dignity of a man trying not to fall apart in public. The horse sensed his rider's unsteadiness and sidestepped nervously, but Bronson held on. Across the valley, Steve McQueen sat astride Midnight with the easy confidence of a man born to be watched. The morning light caught the hard planes of his face, turning him into something mythic. They began to ride toward each other across the red dirt, two legends converging like planets on a collision course. The cameras captured every hoofbeat, every shadow cast by the rising sun. It was beautiful and terrible, this dance between old enemies. But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were all being watched by eyes that weren't supposed to be there. Someone who'd planned this moment down to the last detail. Someone who understood that putting Charles Bronson and Steve McQueen together would be like mixing volatile chemicals. He thought about the life he was trying to protect, his small apartment in Burbank with its collection of empty whiskey bottles he kept as reminders of the man he used to be. The photograph on his mantel of a woman named Sarah, who'd left him 10 years ago when the drinking got bad. The letter from his estranged daughter Katie that he'd been too afraid to open for 6 months. This picture was supposed to be his second chance. The studio executives who'd given him this opportunity had been clear: deliver a hit, and Frank McCarthy would finally graduate from stunt coordinator to director. Fail, and he'd be back to risking his life for other men's glory until his body gave out completely. But now, watching Bronson and McQueen close the distance between them, Frank realized his career might be the least of his worries. Because someone had orchestrated this moment with surgical precision, and Frank was beginning to understand that he wasn't the director of this scene, he was just another actor playing his part in someone else's long game. The horses stopped 10 feet apart, just as scripted. Bronson and McQueen faced each other in the golden light, and Frank held his breath, waiting to see which of them would break first. The silence stretched between the two men like a tripwire waiting to be crossed. Frank watched through the viewfinder as Bronson swayed in his saddle, the morning light cruel on his whiskey-ravaged face. McQueen sat motionless, a coiled spring in human form. Then Charlie Bronson opened his mouth and destroyed everything. "You know what your problem is, Steve?" Bronson's voice carried across the desert air, slurred but venomous. "You think everyone's forgotten what really happened to Elena, but some of us remember the truth." Frank's hand froze on the camera. This wasn't the scripted dialogue. This wasn't even close. McQueen's face went white as bleached bone. "Cut the cameras," he said quietly, but his voice carried like thunder. "Keep rolling," Bronson called out, never taking his bloodshot eyes off McQueen. "Let's give them the real scene, the one we should have shot 15 years ago." Frank felt the earth shift beneath his feet. Around him, the crew exchanged panicked glances. Tommy Chen looked through his camera lens, then at Frank, waiting for direction that Frank couldn't give because his throat had seized up like a rusted engine. "You want to do this here?" McQueen's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper Frank had heard him use just before he'd broken a grip's jaw in Reno 3 years back. "In front of all these people." "Why not?" Bronson lurched forward in his saddle, and thunder whinnied nervously. "They're going to find out anyway. Someone made sure of that when they put us both on this picture." Frank's mind raced. Someone made sure of that. Bronson knew. Somehow the drunk bastard had figured out what Frank was only beginning to understand, that this whole production had been engineered to bring them together. "Charlie," Frank called out, finding his voice. "Let's break for—" "No." The word came from behind Frank, sharp and final. He turned to see Rita Coleman walking toward the horses, her script supervisor clipboard forgotten on the ground. For 30 years, Frank had watched Rita stay in the background, quiet and professional. Now she moved like a woman who'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. "Let them finish it, Frank," Rita said, and her voice carried an authority that made Frank's skin crawl. "They've been running from this conversation for 15 years. Elena deserves to hear it. Elena deserves to hear it." Present tense, as if the dead woman was standing right there in the red dirt, listening. Frank looked at Rita Coleman, really looked at her, and saw something he'd missed for 3 decades, the way she held her shoulders, the tilt of her head, the dark eyes that had always seemed familiar but never quite placeable. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. "You're her sister." Rita smiled, and it was like watching a mask crack apart. "Elena Vasquez Coleman. She took my maiden name when she came to Hollywood. Thought it sounded more exotic for the pictures." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Rita hadn't just been Elena's friend. She'd been family. She'd watched her sister die in that canyon, and she'd spent 15 years working her way up through the Hollywood system, waiting for the right moment to force the truth into the light. "You orchestrated this," Frank said. "The casting, the location, this whole damned production." "I suggested Charles and Steve for the leads," Rita admitted. "I may have mentioned to the right people that they'd be perfect together, that their history would bring authenticity to the roles." She looked at the 2 men on horseback, and her voice turned soft as a prayer. "I've been very patient, Frank, but patience has its limits." On their horses, Bronson and McQueen's stared at each other like gunfighters waiting for high noon. The crew had gone completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something that would either make their careers or end them. "Tell them, Steve," Bronson said, and his voice was steadier now, as if Rita's revelation had sobered him. "Tell them what you did to Elena's car." "I didn't touch her car." McQueen's words came out like ice chips. "No, but you knew someone who did. You knew, and you kept your mouth shut because talking would have meant admitting what you saw. What we both saw." Frank felt the world tilt sideways. His career, his redemption, his carefully planned second chance. It was all crumbling like sandcastles in the tide. But something deeper was breaking apart, too. The careful lies he'd told himself about Durango, about Elena's death, about the reason he'd started drinking in earnest after that film wrapped. Because Frank was beginning to remember things he'd buried. Things about brake lines and mysterious phone calls, and a man who'd disappeared from the crew right after Elena's death. A man whose name had been scrubbed from the credits so thoroughly it was like he'd never existed. Rita Coleman walked closer to the horses, and when she spoke again, her voice carried across Monument Valley like a judgment. "His name was Vincent Cross," she said, "and he's been hiding in this business for 15 years, waiting for all of you to forget. But I never forgot. And now it's time for him to pay." Frank's blood turned to ice water as the final piece clicked into place, because he knew exactly where Vincent Cross was, standing 20 feet away, holding a camera. Frank's legs nearly buckled as he turned to stare at Tommy Chen, except the man he'd known as his director of photography for 2 weeks wasn't Tommy Chen at all. The careful beard, the different hairline, the way he held himself behind the camera. It was all an elaborate disguise that had fooled everyone, including Frank himself. Vincent Cross looked up from his viewfinder and smiled. It was the same cold expression Frank remembered from Durango, back when Vincent had been a second-unit director with ambitions bigger than his talent and a temper that scared even the stunt crews. "Hello, Frank," Vincent said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of barely controlled violence. "Enjoying the show?" The crew began to back away instinctively, sensing predator in their midst. Miguel Santos dropped his clipboard and took 3 quick steps toward the equipment truck. 2 grips simply turned and started walking toward the road, their survival instincts overriding any concern for their paychecks. Frank tried to speak, but his throat had closed up like a fist. 15 years of carefully buried memories came flooding back. Vincent's rage when Elena had started asking questions about the production budget, the way he'd disappeared for 3 hours the morning of the crash, the phone call Frank had overheard but convinced himself he'd misunderstood. "Nothing to say, Bulldog?" Vincent's hands never left the camera, but his knuckles had gone white against the metal housing. "You were always better at following orders than thinking for yourself." On horseback, Bronson and McQueen sat frozen like statues, finally understanding they'd been maneuvered into position like chess pieces. The morning sun climbed higher, washing the red rocks in harsher light that made everything look exposed and raw. "You son of a bitch," Bronson managed, his earlier drunkenness burned away by adrenaline. "You killed her." "Elena killed herself," Vincent said matter-of-factly, adjusting the camera's focus with mechanical precision, the moment she decided to stick her pretty nose where it didn't belong. "I just helped the inevitable along." Frank felt his legs start working again, muscle memory from 30 years of coordinating dangerous stunts kicking in. He began moving sideways, trying to put distance between himself and Vincent while staying close enough to the equipment truck where he kept his emergency kit, including the .38 revolver he'd carried since a prop master went crazy on a set in Tucson. But Vincent tracked his movement without ever looking away from the camera. "Stay where you are, Frank. We're not finished here. Rita's gone to a lot of trouble to arrange this reunion, and I'd hate to disappoint her." Rita Coleman stood perfectly still, her face a mask of controlled fury. 15 years, she whispered. 15 years I've waited to hear you admit it." "And now you have," Vincent said, "though I'm afraid none of you will be around to share the news." His hand moved to something mounted beneath the camera, something that caught the morning light with the dull gleam of gunmetal. Frank's blood turned to slush as he realized Vincent hadn't just been filming the confrontation. He'd been preparing for it. The camera wasn't just a camera, it was a weapon platform, modified to conceal whatever Vincent had planned for his grand finale. McQueen's horse began to dance nervously, sensing its rider's tension. "Easy," Steve murmured, but his eyes never left Vincent. Frank could see McQueen calculating distances, angles, possibilities, the same cold assessment that had made him a legend behind the wheel of a race car. "You know what your mistake was, Vincent?" McQueen said conversationally. "You should have quit while you were ahead, should have stayed buried." Vincent's laugh was like breaking glass. "My mistake was trusting that drunk bastard to keep his mouth shut." He gestured toward Bronson with one hand, while the other remained on his modified camera. "Charlie always was too weak for this business, too sentimental." Frank took another half-step toward the equipment truck, moving with the careful patience of a man who'd spent his life timing dangerous moments. The gun was 30 feet away, locked in a metal case beneath spare film canisters. He might make it if Vincent stayed focused on the mounted men. But Rita Coleman was closer to Vincent than anyone, and Frank could see her muscles coiling like springs. Whatever her plan was, she was about to implement it. "Elena trusted you," she said softly. "She told me you were helping her investigate the missing money. She thought you were her friend." "Elena was a beautiful fool," Vincent replied. "Just like her sister." That's when Rita moved, lunging toward Vincent with 15 years of suppressed rage driving her forward. Frank broke into a run toward the equipment truck. On horseback, both McQueen and Bronson spurred their mounts, and Vincent Cross smiled as he triggered whatever mechanism he'd hidden in his camera, proving that some men wait 15 years not for justice, but for the perfect moment to finish what they started. The explosion that never came left them all suspended in a moment of terrible clarity. Vincent's finger had found the trigger, but instead of fire and destruction, there was only the dry click of a mechanism that had been sabotaged. Rita Coleman's lunge carried her into Vincent's chest, sending them both crashing to the red dirt in a tangle of limbs and fury. The modified camera flew sideways, its hidden weapon clattering across the ground like scattered bones. Frank reached the equipment truck as the horses reared and screamed, their riders fighting to stay mounted as chaos erupted around them. "Miguel!" Frank bellowed, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the lock on the gun case. "The radio! Call the sheriff!" But Miguel Santos was already moving, his nervous energy finally finding purpose as he sprinted toward the communications equipment. Frank's fingers found the .38 cold metal that felt both foreign and familiar in his grip. When he turned back to the struggle, Rita had Vincent pinned to the ground, her hands wrapped around his throat with the methodical patience of someone who'd dreamed of this moment for years. Vincent's face was turning purple, but he was still laughing. "You think this changes anything?" He gasped between Rita's fingers. "Elena's still dead, the money's still gone, and you're all still accessories to murder." The words hit Frank like physical blows, because Vincent was right about one thing: they were all complicit. Frank had seen the signs in Durango, heard the conversations that didn't quite make sense, noticed how Vincent had access to the vehicles the night before Elena's death, but he'd chosen silence because speaking up would have meant admitting his own failures as a coordinator. "Get off him, Rita." Frank's voice cracked like old leather. The gun felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Rita looked up, her face streaked with dust and tears and something that might have been relief. "He killed my sister, Frank. He admitted it. And now we call the law. We do this right." "The law?" Vincent wheezed as Rita reluctantly loosened her grip. "Which law would that be, Bulldog? The one that buried Elena's death 15 years ago? The one that let Steve and Charlie walk away clean because their careers were worth more than one Mexican girl's life?" McQueen's horse finally settled enough for him to dismount. He moved toward them with the careful control of a man walking on thin ice, his famous blue eyes dark with something Frank had never seen there before. "Shame. We didn't know," McQueen said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "We suspected, but we didn't know for certain." Bullshit. Bronson remained mounted, swaying slightly, but more focused than Frank had seen him all morning. "You knew the same as I knew. The same as Frank knew. Vincent had been skimming money from the production, and Elena found out when she threatened to go to the studio. He made sure she couldn't." Frank felt the weight of 15 years pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. The drinking, the failed relationships, the steady slide from respected professional to bitter has-been, it had all started in Durango when he'd chosen cowardice over courage. Vincent struggled to his feet, Rita backing away but staying close enough to grab him if he tried to run. His disguise was ruined now, the careful beard torn away to reveal the face Frank remembered from nightmares. Older, harder, but unmistakably the man who'd vanished from the industry after Elena's death. You want to know about cowardice? Vincent spat blood into the red dirt. Try living underground for 15 years. Try watching all of you build careers on Elena's grave while I scraped by doing industrial films and commercials. Try planning your revenge one careful step at a time, knowing that one mistake would mean spending the rest of your life in prison. So you waited, Rita said, understanding finally complete. You waited until Frank got his big break, until Charles and Steve were vulnerable enough to take a project like this. You waited until you could destroy all of us at once. Vincent's smile was a broken thing, but it held triumph. The modified camera was just insurance. The real weapon was always the truth. By tonight, every entertainment reporter in Hollywood will know that Charles Bronson and Steve McQueen covered up a murder, that Frank McCarthy was too drunk and scared to stop it, that Rita Coleman spent 15 years plotting revenge instead of seeking justice. Frank looked around at the faces surrounding him. Rita with her desperate grief, Bronson with his alcoholic guilt, McQueen with his carefully constructed legend crumbling in real time. The crew had scattered to the edges of the valley, leaving them isolated like survivors of a shipwreck. Miguel's voice crackled over the radio. Sheriff's Department, this is Monument Valley production. We need immediate assistance. We have a situation. Vincent laughed again, the sound echoing off the red rocks like a death rattle. 15 years too late, but better than never, I suppose. Frank realized his finger was resting on the trigger of the .38, and for one terrible moment he understood exactly how Vincent Cross had become a killer. The weight of the .38 felt like holding his own damnation. Frank stared at Vincent Cross through the wavering heat, and for the first time in 15 years allowed himself to remember everything he'd buried beneath whiskey and self-pity. You think you're the only one who planned this, Frank said slowly, his voice cutting through the desert silence like a blade. You think Rita orchestrated this production, that you fooled us all with your Tommy Chen bullshit. Vincent's triumphant smile faltered slightly. Something in Frank's tone had shifted. The broken-down drunk was gone, replaced by the man who'd once coordinated stunts for John Ford himself. But here's what you missed, you arrogant son of a bitch. Frank's finger remained steady on the trigger. Rita didn't suggest Charles and Steve for this picture. I did. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Rita's face went white. McQueen took an involuntary step backward. Even Bronson straightened in his saddle, suddenly stone sober. That's impossible, Vincent said, but his voice had lost its edge of certainty. Rita told you what I asked her to tell you. Frank's laugh was bitter as alkali dust. You think I spent 15 years drinking because of guilt? Because I was too much of a coward to speak up about Elena? Vincent's eyes darted between Frank and Rita, confusion replacing confidence. You're lying. I drank because I knew exactly who killed Elena Vasquez. And I knew that if I tried to prove it, if I tried to expose what really happened in Durango, you'd disappear like smoke, and I'd never get another chance. Frank's mind flashed back to that terrible morning 15 years ago. Not the sanitized version he'd fed himself for years, but the truth he'd locked away like nuclear waste. Vincent emerging from the motor pool at 4 a.m., the brake fluid on his hands that he'd claimed came from helping a grip with his motorcycle. The way Vincent had volunteered to double-check all the vehicles before the canyon drive, professional concern masking murderous opportunity. So I made a choice, Frank continued, the words tasting like poison. I let Elena die. I let you disappear. I let Charles and Steve think they were keeping a secret when the real secret was that I already knew everything. Vincent backed toward the mesa wall, his escape routes narrowing with each revelation. You're trying to save yourself. Trying to play hero after 30 years of... I'm not the hero in this story. Frank's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I'm the man who used a woman's murder as bait. I spent 15 years becoming exactly what you needed me to be. A washed-up drunk desperate for one last shot. I let myself sink low enough that when I finally got backing for this picture, when I suggested Charles and Steve, everyone thought it was desperation casting. Rita's voice came out strangled. Frank, what are you saying? I'm saying I knew Vincent couldn't resist. A chance to destroy all of us at once? In the same kind of location where Elena died? He'd find a way onto this production if it killed him. Frank's smile held no warmth. I just made it easy by hiring his Tommy Chen identity through a shell company I've been funding for 3 years. The revelation hit Vincent like a physical blow. His carefully planned revenge, his patient infiltration, his elaborate disguise, it had all been orchestrated by the man he'd thought was his primary victim. You wanted me here, Vincent said, understanding dawning in his eyes. I needed you here, where I could control the environment, where Rita could get the confession she deserved to hear, where Charles and Steve could finally stop carrying guilt that was never theirs to bear. Frank's finger tightened on the trigger. And where I could finish what should have been done 15 years ago. McQueen's voice cut through the tension. Frank, don't. You're not a killer. Neither was Vincent, until Elena threatened to expose him. Frank kept his eyes locked on Vincent's face. But here's the difference between us, Vincent. You killed an innocent woman to save your pathetic career. I spent 15 years destroying my own career to avenge her. Vincent pressed his back against the red stone. Nowhere left to run. The police are coming. You can't just execute me. Execute you? Frank's laugh echoed off the canyon walls. Vincent, I'm not going to kill you. That would be mercy. Frank lowered the gun, and Vincent's relief lasted exactly 1 second, until he heard the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the desert air. Not 1 helicopter. 3. Sheriff's Department, Frank said conversationally. FBI. And Channel 7 News out of Phoenix. Funny thing about Rita's confession recording. The one she's been wearing under her shirt for 2 weeks. Amazing how good digital equipment has gotten. Vincent's face went ash gray as he realized the full scope of his miscalculation. He hadn't walked into Frank's trap. He'd been living in it for 15 years, waiting for the moment when justice finally came calling. The helicopters circled lower, kicking up red dust that painted everything the color of old blood. Vincent Cross stood frozen against the crimson mesa wall, watching his carefully constructed world collapse with each revolution of the helicopter blades. The sound grew deafening, but it couldn't drown out the echo of Frank's words, I'm not going to kill you. That would be mercy. 15 years, Vincent whispered, more to himself than anyone else. His eyes darted between the approaching aircraft and Frank's weathered face, searching for some angle, some last desperate play. 15 goddamn years you let me think I was hunting you. Rita's hand moved instinctively to the recording device hidden beneath her shirt, the wire Frank had convinced her to wear, not for protection but for prosecution. The confession was complete now, captured in digital clarity that would hold up in any courtroom. Elena's voice could finally rest. You want to know the worst part? Frank said, his voice barely audible over the rotor wash. The .38 hung loose in his grip now, no longer a threat but a prop in a play that was almost finished. I could have stopped you in Durango, could have prevented Elena's death entirely if I'd been paying attention instead of nursing my ego over a budget dispute. The first helicopter touched down 50 yards away, kicking up a dust devil that painted everything sepia. Sheriff's deputies emerged with their weapons drawn but pointed skyward. They'd been briefed, Frank realized. This wasn't a rescue operation. It was an arrest. McQueen dismounted slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. The legendary composure that had made him a star was intact, but something fundamental had shifted behind his blue eyes. The weight of 15 years of misplaced guilt was finally lifting, replaced by a different kind of burden. The knowledge that justice delayed was still justice denied. Steve, Frank said without turning around. You and Charlie get out of here. This isn't your story anymore. Like hell, Bronson's voice carried from horseback, rough with emotion that had nothing to do with whiskey. Elena deserves witnesses. Real ones this time. Vincent laughed, a sound like breaking glass scattered across stone. Witnesses to what? My confession? Your grand revelation? He pushed himself away from the mesa wall, taking a step toward Frank despite the gun. You think this ends it? You think 15 years of planning dies with a few recorded words? The second helicopter was landing now, this one bearing FBI markings. Frank recognized the careful choreography of a federal operation, multiple agencies, media presence, everything documented and witnessed. Rita had done more than wear a wire. She'd orchestrated a public execution of Vincent's reputation. It doesn't end it, Frank admitted, finally meeting Vincent's eyes directly. Nothing ends what you did, but it stops you from doing it again. Vincent's face twisted with something that might have been admiration. You magnificent bastard. You really did plan all of this. The casting, the location, even your own breakdown. How long have you been sober, Frank? 3 years. Since the day I confirmed you were still alive and working under an alias. Frank's admission carried across the desert like a prayer. Rita found you first, but she needed help getting close. Needed someone you'd trust enough to work with. The news helicopter circled overhead, its camera capturing everything for the evening broadcasts that would destroy careers and resurrect old scandals. Hollywood would feast on this story for months. The cover-up, the revenge plot, the elaborate sting operation that had played out like a Western noir. Rita stepped closer to Vincent, her sister's face visible in the set of her jaw. Elena was going to be a teacher, she said quietly. Did you know that? She was only working in film to save money for her education degree. She had plans, dreams, a future you stole for $30,000 in skimmed production costs. Vincent's composure cracked completely. The 15 years of underground exile, of carefully constructed false identities and meticulous planning, dissolved into the desperate rage of a cornered animal. You think I wanted to kill her? You think I planned it? She forced my hand, threatened everything I'd worked for. $30,000, McQueen repeated, his voice flat with disgust. A woman died for $30,000. The sheriff's deputies were moving closer now, their weapons still lowered but their intent clear. Frank could see the lead officer speaking into his radio, coordinating with the federal agents who were establishing a perimeter. This was ending exactly as Rita had planned it, with Vincent Cross taken alive publicly, with enough witnesses and documentation to ensure he'd never escape justice again. Frank looked at the gun in his hand one last time, then let it fall to the red dirt. The weight he'd been carrying for 15 years, guilt, rage, the terrible knowledge of what silence could cost, seemed to fall with it. Elena Vasquez, he said, loud enough for the news cameras to hear. Say her name when you write the story. She wasn't just a victim. She was a person with dreams who died because she believed in doing the right thing. Vincent Cross closed his eyes as the first deputy reached for his handcuffs, finally understanding that some prisons are built from truth, and the walls never crumble. The metallic click of handcuffs closing around Vincent Cross's wrists echoed across Monument Valley, like the final note of a dirge that had been playing for 15 years. Frank watched the deputies secure his prisoner with professional efficiency, but his attention was drawn to something else, the way Vincent's shoulders sagged as the last of his defiance drained away. It's over, Rita whispered, but her voice carried no triumph. She stood apart from the law enforcement personnel securing the scene, her hand still pressed against the recording device that had captured Vincent's confession. The weight of her sister's memory seemed lighter now, but the grief remained, transformed rather than eliminated. McQueen approached Frank slowly, his famous swagger replaced by something more tentative. 15 years of planning, he said. Christ, Frank. What if it hadn't worked? What if he'd gotten suspicious and run again? Frank retrieved his fallen, checking the cylinder before holstering it. Then we'd have tried something else. There's no statute of limitations on murder, Steve. And there's no expiration date on doing what's right. The FBI agents were taking over now, their jurisdictional authority superseding the local sheriff's department. Frank recognized the lead agent, a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd been working this case longer than just today. She approached with Rita in tow, both women moving with the careful precision of people navigating emotional minefields. Mr. McCarthy, the agent said, extending her hand. Special Agent Sarah Thornfield, We've been investigating Vincent Cross's activities under various aliases for the past 18 months. Your cooperation has been invaluable." Frank shook her hand, noting the calluses that suggested she was more than just an administrative investigator. "How long have you known about Elena Vasquez?" "Long enough to know that justice delayed isn't always justice denied." She glanced toward where Vincent was being loaded into the sheriff's helicopter under heavy guard. "He made mistakes over the years. Small ones, but they added up. A pattern of financial irregularities, workplace accidents that happened to people who asked too many questions. Elena wasn't his only victim, Mr. McCarthy. She was just his first." The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow. He'd spent 15 years believing he was avenging one woman's death, only to discover his inaction had enabled others. The weight he'd thought he was shedding suddenly returned, heavier than before. Bronson finally dismounted, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd sobered up fast and hard. He approached Vincent just before the helicopter doors closed, saying something Frank couldn't hear over the rotor noise. Vincent's response was equally inaudible, but the way his face contorted suggested it wasn't pleasant. "What did you tell him?" Frank asked as Bronson returned. "That Elena deserved better witnesses than us the first time around." Bronson's voice was rougher than usual, stripped of its practiced toughness. "And that if he ever gets out of prison, he'll have to deal with more than just the legal system." McQueen's studied both men with the calculating gaze that had made him a star. "So where does this leave us? The picture, I mean. We've still got a crew, still got a schedule to keep." "We finish it," Rita said firmly, surprising everyone. Elena loved movies, loved the craft of storytelling. She would have wanted the film completed, wanted the crew to get paid, wanted something good to come from all this ugliness. Frank felt something shift inside his chest. Not relief exactly, but a loosening of tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. The studio will probably want to distance themselves from the scandal. Bad publicity, legal complications. "Let them try," McQueen said, with some of his old confidence returning. "Charles and I have enough pull to keep this production afloat, especially now that the real story's coming out. Hollywood loves a redemption narrative, even when it's messy." Agent Thornfield closed her notebook and prepared to leave. "You'll all need to make formal statements over the next few days, and Mr. McCarthy, there may be additional charges related to your unconventional investigation methods. Nothing serious, but we need to address the vigilante aspects of this operation." "I understand." Frank watched the sheriff's helicopter lift off, carrying Vincent Cross toward a reckoning that was 15 years overdue. "Agent Thornfield? Those other victims you mentioned, their families deserve to know the truth, too." "They will. Vincent Cross is going to have a very long time to think about all the lives he's damaged." She paused, studying Frank's weathered face. "For what it's worth, Mr. McCarthy, Elena Vasquez would be proud of what you did here. It took courage to wait this long, to plan this carefully. Most people would have wanted immediate satisfaction." As the federal agents departed and the news helicopter circled for final footage, Frank found himself alone with Rita, Bronson, and McQueen in the vast red cathedral of Monument Valley. The morning's drama had played out against the same backdrop where John Ford had filmed his greatest westerns, and Frank couldn't help but appreciate the symmetry. "So what now?" Rita asked. Frank looked toward the horizon where the next scene was scheduled to be shot, then back at the two superstars who'd become something more than actors today. They'd become witnesses to justice finally served. "Now we make the best damn Western anyone's ever seen." 3 months later, Frank stood in the same spot where Vincent Cross had been arrested. But Monument Valley looked different now. The autumn light painted the mesas in softer hues, and the silence carried weight instead of menace. The film was wrapped, the crew long gone, but Frank had returned alone to finish something that couldn't be completed with cameras rolling. He knelt and placed a small wooden cross in the red dirt, not for Vincent, who was awaiting trial in a federal facility, but for Elena Vasquez, whose name was finally carved in honest memory rather than buried in guilty silence. Rita had helped him choose the words, Elena Vasquez, 1951 to 1958. She believed in truth. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up. McQueen emerged from behind a boulder, moving with that familiar measured pace, but something fundamental had changed in his bearing. The haunted quality that had shadowed his eyes for 15 years was gone, replaced by a clarity that made him seem younger despite the gray threading his hair. "Figured I'd find you here," McQueen said, settling onto a flat rock nearby. "Rita said you'd been coming back every few weeks. Habit, I suppose." Frank rose slowly, his knees protesting the desert cold. "How's the picture looking?" "Better than anything either of us deserved to make." McQueen's smile held genuine warmth now. "The studio's calling it a masterpiece. Charles thinks it might be the best work of his career. Hell, mine too." Frank nodded, unsurprised. Something had changed in all of them during those final weeks of shooting. The performances had deepened. The silences between takes had felt purposeful rather than awkward. Grief and redemption, it turned out, were powerful creative fuels when properly channeled. "Vincent's lawyer called yesterday," Frank said. "Plea bargain fell through. Federal prosecutor wants the full trial, all the evidence presented publicly. Elena's case, the others too." McQueen's voice carried no hesitation. "Some things shouldn't be settled quietly in back rooms. Some stories need to be told completely, whatever the cost." A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the canyon walls like the sound of old ghosts finally being laid to rest. Frank watched it soar toward the distant mesas, remembering another bird he'd seen here decades ago when he was young, and thought the world made sense according to simple rules. "I've been thinking about retiring," Frank said. "For real this time. You're 58, not 88. What would you do with yourself?" "Rita's starting a foundation, scholarship fund for young women in film, named after Elena. Could use someone who knows the business, knows how to spot the predators before they get established." Frank's laugh held irony rather than humor. "Turns out spending 15 years hunting one killer teaches you how to recognize the signs." McQueen studied the memorial cross, its simple wood stark against the ancient stone. "We could have prevented this, you know. All of it. If we'd been paying attention instead of protecting our own careers. Maybe. Or maybe we'd have driven him underground sooner, given him more time to perfect his methods." Frank shrugged. "I've stopped playing the what-if game, Steve. It's a rigged casino. The house always wins." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun tracked across the sky, casting shadows that shifted like memories across the desert floor. Frank thought about the young stuntman he'd been when he first came to Monument Valley, full of dreams and certainty about heroes and villains. That man felt like a stranger now, someone glimpsed through old photographs rather than lived experience. "Charles is getting married," McQueen said eventually. "Met a woman during post-production, the sound engineer. Says he wants kids, wants to build something instead of just tearing things down. What about you?" McQueen's smile was enigmatic. "Taking some time off. Maybe buy that ranch I've been talking about for years. Learn to be still for a while, see what that feels like." The hawk returned, settling on a distant outcropping to watch the valley with predators' patience. Frank envied its simplicity. Hunt, eat, survive, no moral calculations required. But then he thought about Rita's fierce dedication to her sister's memory, about the careful way McQueen and Bronson had rebuilt their friendship during the final weeks of shooting, about the moment when Vincent's facade finally cracked and revealed the frightened man underneath. Maybe the moral calculations were worth the complexity they brought. Frank stood and dusted red sand from his knees, taking one last look at Elena's memorial. Tomorrow he would drive back to Los Angeles and begin the process of dismantling his old life, selling the house where he'd nursed his guilt and rage, donating his collection of stunt equipment to film schools, preparing for whatever came next. "You ready?" McQueen asked. Frank nodded, following his old friend toward the waiting truck. Behind them, the memorial cross caught the afternoon light like a small promise kept against impossible odds. The desert would weather it smooth eventually, but for now it stood, simple, honest, and unafraid of what the wind might bring. Some stories, Frank thought, were worth the waiting.